Hannah Whitaker had exactly $3 a land deed nobody believed was real, and a dead man's promise to hold on to. When she rode into Red Hollow that August morning and saw the rope already knotted above a man's head, her hands stopped shaking for the first time since Missouri. Not because she wasn't afraid, because she finally understood what she was supposed to do with it. She walked her horse straight through the crowd, looked up at the biggest, most dangerous man she had ever seen in her life, and said the only thing that made sense. If this story already has your heart beating faster, subscribe to this channel, follow along until the very end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The sun had been punishing Red Hollow since June, and by the time Hannah Whitaker's wagon rolled down the main street on the 14th of August, the whole town smelled like dust and old fear. Not the fresh kind of fear that makes a person sharp. The settled kind. The kind that lives in a place so long it starts to feel like common sense. She hadn't come to witness anything. She had come because her uncle was dead, and he'd left her a ranch she'd never seen, and a deed that said she had to be standing on that land within 90 days of his passing, or it reverted to someone named Silas Vane. She had 61 days remaining. She had a wagon, 2 horses, a rifle she'd fired exactly 4 times, and the address of a lawyer who she would learn in approximately 40 minutes had already been paid by Silas Vane to discourage any woman from making the ride up into the mountains alone. Hannah didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was that something was wrong in this town square. The crowd was too quiet for a hanging. That was the first thing she noticed. Hangings drew noise. Men shouted, women covered their children's eyes, somebody always prayed too loud. But this crowd stood with their arms crossed and their mouths flat, like they'd already decided they didn't need to feel anything about what was happening. Like it wasn't really a hanging at all. Like it was just a correction being made to something that should never have existed in the first place. The man beneath the rope was the largest human being Hannah had ever seen. She told herself later that it was his stillness that stopped her. Not his size, not his appearance, not the blood running freely from a cut above his left eye. It was the way he stood with 6 armed men around him and didn't move a single muscle. Not to beg, not to fight, not to flinch when the sheriff's deputy stepped too close on purpose. He simply stood there like a mountain that had decided it was tired of being climbed. His wrists were bound behind him. His sleeveless leather vest was torn at the shoulder. Long black hair hung loose around his face, and a dark beard covered a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something harder than most men's bones. His arms were exposed, heavily scarred, and even at rest, they communicated a kind of power that made the 6 men surrounding him look like a formality rather than a genuine threat. His eyes were gray. Hannah noticed that because she was close enough to notice, having pushed her wagon further into the square than any sensible person should have. And his eyes were moving slowly across the crowd with an expression she recognized from somewhere deep and difficult in her own memory. That expression wasn't anger. It was the look of a man who had already tried the truth and watched it get thrown back in his face so many times that he had simply stopped reaching for it. Her father had worn that same expression on the last day she saw him standing upright. Sheriff Amos Rusk was reading from a paper in his left hand. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with a badge that caught the morning sun and a voice that had long since learned to sound more confident than he actually was. He read quickly, like he wanted to finish before he had to think too hard about what the words meant. The man beneath the rope, the document called him. Caleb Mercer was charged with attacking 2 mining guards, stealing explosives from the Red Hollow Mining Company, and conspiring to destroy company property. Silas Vane stood 10 feet from the sheriff with his hands folded in front of him like a man at church. He was well-dressed, clean-shaved, and wore the particular expression of someone who had already arranged the outcome and was merely waiting politely for the ceremony to conclude. He was perhaps 52, 53. Silver at his temples. A watch chain across his vest that cost more than most men in this crowd earned in 6 months. This man, Vane said, addressing the crowd rather than the sheriff, has been a danger to this community since before most of you arrived here. He attacked workers. He intimidated families. He has lived in these mountains like a wolf lives in the hills, doing what he wants, answering to no one until somebody finally had the courage to bring him to account. Several people in the crowd nodded. Hannah watched them nod. She watched them nod at a man who was standing bound and bleeding, while another man in a very expensive vest described him like a weather event. She was already holding the reins tighter than she needed to. Sheriff Rusk cleared his throat. "Caleb Mercer, you have been read the charges against you. Do you have any final words?" The square went completely quiet. The man under the rope lifted his eyes from somewhere on the middle distance and looked directly at the mountains north of town. Not at the crowd, not at Vane, not at the sheriff, at the mountains. And then, in a voice that was low and flat and entirely unhurried, he said, "Dig beneath the burned bridge." That was all. Several men in the crowd exchanged looks. Someone laughed. The laughter spread until it wasn't funny enough to continue and dissolved back into silence. Vane smiled with one side of his mouth. "As you can see," he said, "the man has nothing coherent to offer." Hannah's wagon had stopped moving sometime during the reading of the charges. She hadn't consciously stopped it. Her hands had simply stopped cooperating with the forward motion because a different part of her brain had taken over and was now conducting a very rapid inventory of everything she was looking at. The crates at the foot of the hanging tree. 2 of them. Pine boxes stamped in black ink. Red Hollow Mining Company. Property of. The charge was that Caleb Mercer had stolen explosives from the company. Those were supposedly the stolen explosives. Hannah had grown up watching her father balance accounts for a dry goods merchant. She had kept books herself from the age of 14. She knew what shipping marks looked like. She knew what a fresh mark looked like versus one that had been sitting on a crate through weather and handling. The shipping mark on the second crate was fresh. The ink hadn't even faded at the edges. In this heat, in this sun, on a pine box, that mark had been stamped within the last 2 or 3 days. She'd seen Caleb Mercer for the first time 30 seconds ago. She didn't know how long he'd been in custody, but the deputy who'd ridden through the last town she'd passed through had mentioned that the mountain man had been held for nearly a week. The crate that was supposedly evidence of what he'd stolen had a shipping mark newer than his arrest. Hannah set the brake on her wagon. She climbed down. A woman standing at the edge of the crowd caught her arm gently. "Honey, you don't want to go up there." "Ma'am," Hannah said, "I believe somebody should." She walked to the front. She wasn't graceful about it. She was wearing a travel-dirty dress and boots that had been resoled once already, and her hair had lost most of its arrangement somewhere around the Colorado border. She was 30 years old and looked it in the way that women who have done real work look, their age not worn down, but marked. Present. Solid in a way that took up space. "Sheriff," she said. Rusk turned to look at her with the expression of a man encountering an obstacle he hadn't anticipated. "Ma'am, this is an official proceeding." "That crate," Hannah said, pointing. "The second one. When was it shipped?" "I don't see how that's—" "The mark is fresh. This man has been in your custody for how long?" 6 days, Rusk said before he could stop himself. "Then that crate arrived after he was arrested." Hannah kept her voice even. "Which means either someone shipped stolen explosives back to the company who owned them, which doesn't make sense, or that crate wasn't in this man's possession when you arrested him, which means it isn't evidence of anything except that someone placed it here after the fact." The silence in the square changed quality. Silas Vane stepped forward. His smile didn't move, but his eyes sharpened. "Miss Whitaker, Hannah Whitaker, I've come to claim my uncle's ranch." Something moved through Vane's expression too fast for her to name. "Ah," he said, "the Whitaker girl. We were told you weren't coming." "You were told wrong." Hannah turned back to the sheriff. "I'm asking you a direct question about evidence being used to hang a man. When did that crate arrive?" "Ma'am, you don't understand the full history between this man and—" "I understand fresh ink," Hannah said. Caleb Mercer had not moved. But she felt his attention shift. She felt it the way you feel a large, very quiet animal become aware of you, not threatening, but fully concentrated in a way that altered the air between them. She made herself look at him directly. He was looking back. Those gray eyes held no gratitude, no relief, no softening of any kind. What they held was a careful, unblinking assessment, The kind a man does when he's deciding whether what he's looking at is real or just another version of the same disappointment. "You're going to be sorry you spoke up," Vane said quietly, close enough to her now that the words weren't quite public. "Red Hollow is my town, Miss Whitaker. Your uncle learned that the hard way." Hannah's heart was striking hard inside her chest. She kept her face from showing it. "How did my uncle learn it?" she asked. "Officially, he died in a riding accident." Vane said nothing. "Sheriff Rusk," she said louder now, turning back. "My uncle's land deed includes a territorial provision. I have it here." She opened her bag and produced the document. She'd read it so many times on the road that she'd essentially memorized it. "Any employee or lawful resident of Whitaker Ranch who is charged with a crime falls under the jurisdiction of the circuit court, not the municipal authority of Red Hollow. The ranch sits outside your town limits." Rusk looked at the document. He looked at Vane. "He isn't your employee," Rusk said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Not yet," Hannah said. She turned to face Caleb Mercer. The crowd had gone very quiet again. Caleb looked down at her from beneath the hanging rope, and she looked up at him, and she was aware in some distant reporting part of her brain that this was probably the most consequential moment of her adult life, and she was doing it in dirty boots. "I need a ranch foreman," she said. "I have a deed of failing property and 61 days to make it work. I'm told the land is in rough shape and the trail up is dangerous." She kept her voice steady. "I cannot pay wages yet, but I can offer shelter food and a legal claim against whatever charges they're trying to make stick to you." Caleb studied her. His expression did not change. "You don't know what follows me," he said. The voice surprised her. It was quiet. Not soft quiet is different from soft, but measured. Like every word cost something he'd accounted for before spending it. "I know what's standing behind you right now," Hannah said. "A rope. A sheriff who looks like he'd rather be somewhere else, and a very well-dressed man who tampered with evidence." She paused. "Whatever follows you can't be worse than what's already in front of you." "You'd be surprised," Caleb said. "Possibly," she agreed. "I'd like the chance to be." Silas Vane laughed. It was the kind of laugh that was meant to make other people feel foolish for taking something seriously. "Miss Whitaker, I respect your spirit, truly. But an employment contract won't satisfy a criminal charge, and no judge in this territory would accept." "No," Hannah said. "But a marriage would." The square went silent in a way it hadn't been before. Even the horses seemed to stop moving. Hannah kept her eyes on Caleb Mercer and did not let herself look away, because if she looked away now, she would look at the crowd, and if she looked at the crowd, she would understand how many of them thought she had just lost her mind. And she couldn't afford to understand that at this particular moment. "A spouse," she said, "falls under the property rights of the homestead deed. A husband of a Whitaker Ranch resident cannot be tried in a municipal court for crimes allegedly committed before the marriage under an existing territorial provision established in 1869. Judge Cole." She gestured toward the older man she'd noticed near the back of the crowd, a traveling magistrate she'd been told about at the last relay station. "Can confirm whether I'm reading that correctly. Judge Nathan Cole, who was approximately 70 years old and had the expression of a man who had seen most things human beings were capable of, and had long since made his peace with the variety, stepped forward through the crowd and examined the document she held out. He read it twice. "She's reading it correctly," he said. Vane's jaw shifted. Rusk looked between the Judge Vane and Hannah with the expression of a man watching a card game in which he'd bet heavily on the wrong hand. "Marry me, Caleb Mercer," Hannah said. She kept her voice level, because her voice was the one thing she could control. "Become my lawful husband. Come home with me before these men hang you for knowing something they'd rather you didn't." The silence stretched out. "Miss," said one of the armed deputies. "You can't just—" "Ma'am," Caleb said quietly, and the deputy stopped talking. He was looking at Hannah with that same careful, assessing gaze. Then he said low and direct, "If I tell you to ride, you ride. You don't stop for me. You don't look back. You just ride." "Agreed," Hannah said. "If I tell you the roof needs fixing, you fix it. We can negotiate the rest on the trail." Something crossed Caleb's face. It wasn't a smile. It was something just to the left of a smile, Something that had probably been in the neighborhood of a smile before several years of very hard events had moved it further down the block. It was there for approximately half a second, and then it was gone. "All right," he said. Vane stepped forward. "Rusk." "Mr. Vane," Judge Cole said, with the particular mildness of a man who does not need volume to communicate authority. "I'm going to advise you to let the sheriff proceed according to the law, since we appear to have a legal instrument that changes the jurisdictional question here. Unless you'd like to explain to a territorial court why you intervened." Vane stopped. The look he gave Hannah was not the look of a man who had lost. It was the look of a man who had simply moved his timetable. "You have 90 days, Miss Whitaker," he said. "I'll be counting them." Judge Cole performed the ceremony beneath the cottonwood tree. It was brief, plain, and witnessed by a crowd that watched in the particular stunned silence of people who have seen something they don't have a category for yet. Hannah said the words. Caleb said the words. The judge pronounced them married under the laws of Colorado Territory. Someone in the back of the crowd started to say something, and then thought better of it. When Rusk cut the rope from Caleb's wrists, the blood had already dried in lines down his forearms. Caleb stood still for a moment, flexing his hands slowly, like a man reacquainting himself with the concept of being able to move them. Then he bent down, picked up Hannah's heavy traveling trunk from the wagon bed, and carried it without asking whether she wanted him to. Hannah watched him do it. She watched the crowd part for him, the way water parts for something large moving through it. Not willingly, but because the alternative was being in the way. Vane touched her arm as she turned to follow. "That man," Vane said very quietly, "killed 12 workers in a mine explosion 3 years ago. He's been living in these mountains ever since, because the territory would have hanged him if he came down. Whatever he told you about himself, whatever he let you believe, I want you to understand what you've just bound yourself to." Hannah looked at his hand on her arm until he removed it. "Mr. Vane," she said, "when I find something I don't understand, I ask for evidence." She picked up her bag. "I'll be doing the same with whatever you just said." She walked to her wagon. Caleb had already arranged her trunk and was checking the axles, running a hand along the wheel spokes with the automatic competence of a man who has spent years keeping equipment functional because his life depended on functional equipment. He didn't look up when she approached. He simply moved to the driver's side and took the reins. "I can drive my own." "I know the trail," he said. "You don't." Hannah climbed up and sat beside him. As they pulled out of the square, she heard Vane say something to the sheriff too low for her to catch the words. She didn't turn around, but she felt it, the sensation of being watched by someone who had already started calculating how to remove an obstacle they hadn't expected. She focused on the road ahead instead. The mountains north of town rose sharp and pale gold against a sky the color of hammered copper. The heat pressed down from above and rose up from the baked earth, and the air between Red Hollow and the high country smelled like juniper and old fire. They were clear of the last buildings before either of them spoke again. "You said you read the deed before today," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "On the road, several times. The provision you cited, you knew it applied to a spouse, not just an employee." "Yes." "Before you saw me," Hannah considered that. "I knew the provision existed. I didn't know I'd need it until I saw the crate." "What made you look at the crate?" "The ink was wrong." She paused. "My father kept books. I grew up watching him look for things that didn't add up." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The ledger Vane is looking for," he said. "It proves the explosion wasn't an accident. It proves he purchased rotten supports and bribed the safety inspector. My brother Daniel was one of the 12 men who died." He said it the way people say true things they've carried so long, the weight has become familiar. "I found evidence of the corruption before the explosion. I tried to report it. Vane made sure every account I gave was documented as the ramblings of a man with a grudge." "How long have you been trying to clear your name?" 3 years. "And the ledger? Where is it?" "Beneath the burned bridge, the one I told them to dig under in the square." "You told them directly?" "I did." "And they laughed?" "They did." Hannah thought about that. The bridge burned in the explosion. 6 months after. Vane burned it deliberately to keep people from the North Trail. The ledger was hidden by Daniel before he died. He knew what was in it. He knew Vane would come for it if he tried to move it, so he left it and got word to me. I've been trying to get to it for 3 years without Vane's men stopping me first. He paused. The accusation that I was stealing explosives, I was actually trying to get to the bridge. They arrested me before I reached it. Hannah absorbed this. He controls the sheriff, she said. He controls most of the town. Rusk owes him money. The bank owes him capital. Half the merchants have loans with his company. A man who holds enough debt holds enough people. My uncle, Hannah said carefully. Vane said he learned the hard way that Red Hollow was his town. Caleb's hands tightened briefly on the reins. He released the tension deliberately. Your uncle's death, he said. I don't know for certain, but I know his account books were the second piece of the evidence Vane destroyed. Your uncle had been recording payments, water rights payments from the mine that didn't match the official contracts. He'd been in contact with Daniel before the explosion. Hannah felt something settle cold and certain in her chest. His death was not an accident. I can't prove it yet. But you believe it. A long pause. The wagon wheels found a rut and corrected. Yes, Caleb said. Hannah looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about her uncle, who she hadn't seen in 11 years, because distance and hard circumstances had kept them apart, and who had left her his land, not because he thought she'd want it, but because he'd known she was the kind of person who would come, who would ask questions, who would not be intimidated by expense accounts and town politics, and a man in an expensive vest standing too close. He'd known that because her father had been the same way, and her father had been destroyed for it. Hannah was not her father. She had read every document her uncle sent her. She had kept them. She had memorized the deed on a 3-day wagon journey, because something in the wording had told her she was going to need to know it in a hurry. She had not ridden all the way from Missouri to be intimidated back. We need the ledger, she said. Yes, and we need my uncle's account books if any of them survived. How much of the ranch has Vane already gone through? I don't know. I've never been to it. I only know the boundary lines. He paused. I know the spring. What about it? The Whitaker Spring is the only reliable water source between Red Hollow and the northern grazing country for approximately 40 miles. The mine Vane wants to reopen needs a water supply for the ore washing. Without access to that spring, the mine isn't commercially viable. He said it plainly. Your ranch isn't valuable because of the land. It's valuable because of the water. And if I abandon the deed, ownership reverts to Vane. By the terms of the original grant, Hannah was quiet for a moment. He'll divert the spring. He'll divert the spring. And he's had 61 days warning that I might come. Yes. Which means the ranch has probably been damaged, Caleb said. Yes, I'd expect damage. They rode in silence for a while. The trail began to climb. The valley below spread out behind them, brown and gold and wavering in the heat. A hawk turned slow circles above a distant ridge. You didn't expect any of this morning, Caleb said. He wasn't accusing her. He was simply noting a fact. No, Hannah agreed. I expected to find a lawyer, get directions to the ranch, and spend a week assessing what I'd inherited. I did not expect a hanging. You could still turn back. Mr. Mercer. Caleb. She adjusted the word. It fit differently than she expected. I've spent the last 6 months making arrangements, selling most of what I owned, and traveling across 3 territories on the premise that I was going to keep my uncle's land. I have 61 days to do it. Silas Vane killed my uncle to prevent anyone from doing exactly that. She paused. I am not turning back. Another silence longer than the others. The men he sent after us, Caleb said. Hannah's head came up. What? Behind us. 2 riders. They've been following since the edge of town. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the trail. They'll wait until after dark. Probably try to spook the horses on the narrow section above the second switchback. Make it look like an accident on a mountain trail. How do you know that's where they'll try? Because it's where I would try. He said it without any particular emphasis. I'm going to change the route at the next junction. We'll reach the ranch by nightfall, but it'll be slower going. Will they follow the change? Some will. I know another way that's harder to track by moonlight. He glanced at her for the first time since they'd left town. Can you handle a rough trail in the dark? Hannah thought about the 3 days she'd spent driving through unmarked creek crossings south of the border. Yes, she said. Something in his expression shifted just slightly. Not approval exactly. Recognition maybe. Like something he'd tentatively assessed had confirmed itself. All right, he said. Then we'll make it. The trail bent north, and the town disappeared behind the ridge, and it was just the two of them, the wagon, the horses, and the enormous burnt copper silence of the Colorado high country in August. Hannah was married to a man she had met 40 minutes ago. She was riding toward a ranch she had never seen, that had almost certainly been deliberately damaged, that contained the water rights a powerful man would do anything to acquire. Somewhere behind them, 2 riders followed. Somewhere ahead of them, beneath the ruins of a burned bridge, lay the evidence that could bring the whole structure of Silas Vane's carefully constructed truth to the ground. And somewhere in the quiet beside her, a man who had not spoken more than 200 words in 3 years of living. Like a hunted thing, was holding the reins of her wagon with scarred and capable hands, and had promised in the plainest possible terms to tell her to ride if it came to that. He had not promised he would be fine. He had not promised things would work out. He had made her one specific promise about one specific action, and she understood already that it was the most honest promise he knew how to make, because it was the only promise he was absolutely certain he could keep. Hannah Whitaker sat up straight on the wagon bench in the last golden light of the afternoon. She was not her father. She had 61 days. And she had the sudden, complicated, entirely inconvenient sense that she had just made the best decision she'd made in a very long time. They reached the ranch well after dark. Caleb had taken the alternate trail, rougher, steeper, the kind of path that required the horses to feel their way rather than see it, and Hannah had not complained once. Not when the wagon tilted hard on a switchback, and her trunk shifted, and she had to brace herself against the side rail. Not when a branch she hadn't seen came out of the darkness and caught her across the cheek. Not when the trail narrowed to the point where she could hear loose rock falling away somewhere below the wheel and couldn't see how far down it went. She'd held the rail, steadied her breathing, and kept her eyes on the trail ahead. Caleb noticed. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. The riders following them had lost the track somewhere near the second junction. He'd heard them moving parallel for a while. Then the sound had faded and gone quiet. That kind of quiet was either good news or the kind of quiet that meant someone had stopped moving because they'd found a better position. He wasn't certain which, and that uncertainty sat in his chest, the way uncertainties always sat, not loudly, but constantly, like a sound just below hearing that never quite went away. When the trail finally leveled and the outline of the ranch buildings came up against the stars, he pulled the wagon to a stop and sat still for a moment listening. Nothing wrong in the sounds. Crickets. A nighthawk somewhere high up. The horses were calm, which was a better reading of the air than anything he could do himself. He climbed down. Hannah was already climbing down on the other side before he could come around to offer a hand, and he noted that too, filed it alongside the part where she'd read the shipping marks in under a minute, and cited a territorial provision from memory while standing under a hanging tree. He unhooked the lantern from the wagon hook and struck a match. The light showed him the ranch, and what it showed him made something tighten hard in his jaw. Hannah had gone still beside him. The cabin door hung open at the wrong angle, which meant the upper hinge had been pulled from the frame deliberately. The water trough beside the corral had been smashed, not cracked, not weather damaged, but knocked apart in the precise way you knock something apart when you want to send a message rather than simply break it. 3 of the fence posts along the near pasture had been pulled from the ground and laid flat. The hay in the small shed was still there, but it had been scattered rather than stacked, which would make it harder to gather and easier to rot if rain came. It was done by someone who knew how to damage a working property without burning it down. Burning it down would be too obvious. This was the kind of damage that says we were here, and you can't prove it was us. But you know, and we know you know, and you understand what that means. How recent? Hannah said. It wasn't a question exactly. 2 days, Caleb said. Maybe 3. He crouched near the nearest fence post and examined the ground around the base. Mining boots, same tread I saw around the square this morning, at least 3 men. Hannah stood in the open doorway of the cabin, holding the frame with one hand where the hinge had been. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very evenly, "I'd like to ride back to town and say several things to Silas Vane." "I know," Caleb said. "You're going to tell me not to. I'm going to tell you that an accusation without proof is only another rumor, and right now he's got the sheriff, and we've got a broken water trough." She let out a breath. It wasn't quite a sigh, and it wasn't quite a curse, but it lived in that territory. "Fine," she said. "What do we fix first?" That surprised him. Not the practicality he'd already assessed her as practical, but the speed of it. The way she moved from anger to action in the time it took most people to finish being angry. "The hinge," he said. "Then we need water for the horses. There's a spring line somewhere above the north pasture. That's what your uncle built the property around. If Vane's men haven't interfered with it yet, we can run water to a temporary trough tonight." "Do you know where the spring line runs?" "I know where it starts. I'll find where it ends." Hannah went inside to assess the cabin. Caleb took the horses to the back of the property, found the spring channel intact, which told him Vane wasn't ready to play that particular card yet, and got the animals settled. By the time he came back, Hannah had the lantern hung from a ceiling beam, had found a hammer and a spare hinge pin in a tool crate under the cabin floor, and was holding both up when he came through the door. "Is this the right size?" she asked. He examined it. "Yes. Good. I found the account books too. Or what's left of them." She nodded toward the table where several water-stained ledgers were spread open. "Someone went through them before I got here. Pages are missing. But not all of them. My uncle was careful about which pages he kept together and which ones he stored separately." Caleb set the hinge pin against the doorframe and reached for the hammer. "How do you know which ones are missing?" "Because the numbering jumps. He used a consecutive system date reference number payment amount. Look." She pointed to a page without crowding him, standing a reasonable distance back, which he also noted. "The sequence goes 1718, then 22. 4 entries removed. But the ones on either side reference the same account, Vane's ore washing payment. So whoever took the pages knew exactly what to look for, which means they'd seen the originals before. Your uncle showed Vane the books. Or Vane's man got in here before I arrived and already knew what was in them." She paused. "Which would mean he's been planning this since before my uncle died. Since before he knew I was coming." Caleb drove the hinge pin home with 3 clean strikes. "The missing pages," he said. "They may have been copied before they were removed. Your uncle was methodical. He wouldn't have kept everything in one place." Hannah looked at him. "You knew my uncle." "I knew of him. Daniel was in contact with him. He mentioned a man in Red Hollow who was keeping water records and had a ranch north of town that Vane wanted." "Did Daniel tell you his name?" "He said your uncle's name was Elias." Something moved across Hannah's face. She looked down at the ledger for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Elias Whitaker, my father's older brother." She was quiet. "I hadn't seen him in 11 years. He wrote me letters. I kept all of them." She straightened. "He wrote me about the water payments. He wrote me that the numbers didn't match the official contracts. He was going to testify, and then his letters stopped coming, and then I got a notice from a territorial land office saying he'd died and left me the property. And you came. And I came." She closed the ledger. "What did your brother tell you exactly about Elias?" Caleb set the hammer down on the table. He didn't answer immediately. It was the particular pause of a man selecting which truth to offer from a larger truth he wasn't ready to open completely. "He told me that Elias had found the discrepancy in the water contracts, that he'd traced it back to a payment made 18 months before the explosion. Vane had redirected water from the spring line through the mine's processing operation without registering the usage change, which meant the spring was being commercially exploited under a residential deed, which is illegal under territorial land law. Vane was using my uncle's water to run an illegal operation, and your uncle had the records to prove it. And now my uncle is dead." "Yes." Hannah put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then she picked up the ledger, organized the remaining pages, and set it carefully back in the crate. "We need to find what he hid separately," she said. "He would have made copies. He was that kind of man. My father was the same. You don't keep the only version of something important in the obvious place. We'll search the property in the morning, carefully, without making it look like we're searching. Because Vane's men may come back. Because Vane's men will come back. The question is when and how." He'd said "we" twice in the space of a minute. He hadn't meant to. The word felt strange in his mouth, like clothing that hadn't been worn in long enough that it needed breaking in again. Hannah had noticed. He could tell because she didn't comment on it, and people only don't comment on things when they've decided the comment would cost more than the silence. They worked through the first hour without talking much. He repaired the worst of the corral fence while she organized the cabin interior, moving with the efficiency of someone who knows how to set up a functional space quickly. She found her uncle's tool store. Much of it had been thrown around, but not removed, and set the most necessary items in order. When he came back inside, there was water heated on the small stove, and 2 plates set on the table, with what she'd had in the wagon's provision box. He looked at the 2 plates. "Sit," she said. He sat. The meal was trail food, hard biscuits, dried beef, a tin of beans she'd heated through. It was not remarkable food in any way. He ate it with full attention, the way a man eats when he has been operating on inadequate nutrition for long enough that even plain food registers as significant. Hannah watched him for a moment. Not in the examining way, more the way a person watches when they're fitting pieces of information together. "When did you last eat a meal at a table?" she asked. He thought about it. 11 months ago, maybe 12. "Where?" "Ruth Bell's boarding house. She let me come in the back." He paused. "She didn't believe I was responsible for the explosion. She lost her son in it. You'd think that would make her more likely to blame me, not less." "She sounds like a woman who pays attention to evidence." "She is." Hannah was quiet for a moment, working at a biscuit. Then, "Vane told me you killed 12 men." "I know what Vane told you. He believed I'd turn back if he said it. Most people would. I asked him for evidence. He didn't give any." She met his eyes across the table. "You told me about Daniel, about the ledger, about what you've been trying to do for 3 years. That's not a confession, and it's not a defense, it's information. I'm still assembling the picture." She paused. "I don't need you to convince me of anything tonight. I just need to know that what you've told me is the honest version." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "The honest version," he said, "is that I knew the supports were compromised. I reported it twice through the foreman. I was told the inspection had cleared them. I believed it because I wanted to believe it, and I should not have. I should have walked into that mine and pulled every one of those men out myself before the inspection report came back." He kept his voice flat because the alternative was something he wasn't willing to do at a table with a woman he'd known for 6 hours. "I didn't. And 12 men died. Vane caused it and covered it and blamed me for it, and all of that is true. And it is also true that I carry the part that was mine to carry." Hannah set down her biscuit. "That," she said quietly, "is the most honest thing I've heard a man say in several years." He didn't respond to that. After dinner, he took the blanket from his pack and moved toward the door. "There's a second sleeping area at the back," Hannah said. "My uncle used it for a hired hand. It's not separate, it's just a curtain, but it's there. I'll sleep outside. The men who followed us are better deterred by someone outside than in." He said it factually, not to reassure her. "I'll be at the corral. If anything moves on the trail, I'll hear it." Hannah studied him for a moment. Then she simply said, "All right." He slept against the corral post for 3 hours, which was longer than he'd expected to sleep, and woke before first light to the sound of the horses shifting. Not alarmed, just aware of something on the lower trail. He was on his feet before he was fully conscious, knife in hand, listening. A deer, moving up the creek bed to the south. The horses relaxed, and he stood in the dark for a moment more before putting the knife away. The stars above the ridge were fading. The air had that particular quality of mountain pre-dawn cool and entirely still. Like the world was holding one more breath before the heat came back. He thought about Daniel. He did that most mornings quickly, like pressing a bruise to confirm it was still there. Daniel, who had been 26 years old. Daniel, who had 3 children and a wife named Clara, and who had written in the margins of Hannah Whitaker's account book in the small, neat hand he'd had since childhood. Daniel, who had known the ledger was important and hidden it under a burned bridge because he understood that truth sometimes needed to wait for the right person to come looking. Caleb had been trying to be that person for 3 years. He had not managed it yet. He went to work. By the time Hannah emerged from the cabin at first light, he had repaired 2 of the 3 sections of downed fence, gotten the horses into the upper pasture, and located where the spring channel had been partially blocked, not severely, not enough to stop the water, but enough to slow it, and cleared the blockage. She came out, saw the fence, looked at the pasture, looked at him. "You've been awake since early," he said. She brought him coffee. He hadn't expected that either. She handed it to him without ceremony, and he took it and drank it standing by the fence line, and she stood a few feet away drinking her own, and neither of them spoke for a while. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had each learned through different and difficult paths that not everything needs to be said. "I want to find where my uncle hid the copies," she said eventually. "If they exist." "They exist," Caleb said. "I'm certain of it." Why? Because Daniel trusted him. Daniel didn't trust carefully. He was the kind of man who gave trust quickly and broadly, and usually correctly. When he said Elias was careful, he meant it as the highest compliment. Hannah looked out toward the upper pasture. "My uncle used to send me letters with the date written in a particular place. Never at the top, always at the end of the first paragraph, 2 spaces in, from the left margin. My mother thought it was an eccentricity. I always thought it was a code of some kind, something he did out of habit from a time when the habit had mattered. A signal, or a marker, something that could tell you where to look if you knew what to look for." She turned back to him. His letters mentioned the property, the spring. He described it in detail, the exact measurements, the channel angle, a stone he'd set as a marker at the upper junction. She paused. He described it in a way that was more precise than a man usually is about a feature he walks past every day. Caleb understood what she was saying. "The stone," he said. "The stone. They found it an hour later. A flat granite marker set into the bank of the spring channel at the upper junction, exactly as Elias had described it in his second-to-last letter. Beneath the stone, wrapped in oilcloth and packed in a tin that had been sealed with wax, were 7 pages of copied account entries and a separate folded document, a statement in Elias's handwriting addressed to the Circuit Court of Colorado Territory. Hannah read it first. Her face didn't change much while she read, but her jaw set, and when she finished, she passed it to Caleb without speaking. He read it. Hannah Whitaker had been documenting Vane's water theft for 14 months. He had identified the exact payments, the exact dates, the names of the men who'd received bribes to alter the registration records. He had written 3 letters to the Territorial Land Office. None had received responses, which he wrote he attributed to the likelihood that the land office clerk had been compensated by the same account that compensated the mine inspector. At the end of the statement, in smaller writing than the rest, was a single additional paragraph. "If my niece Hannah reads this, I need her to know that I left her this land, not because I expected her to fight this battle, but because I knew she was the one person in my family who would understand that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are unreasonable. I am sorry I did not keep a better watch. I got careless at the end, and I believe Vane knows what I have. By the time this is read, it may be too late for me. It is not too late for the truth." Hannah took the document back. She folded it carefully along its original lines, wrapped it in the oilcloth, and placed it in her inside pocket. She didn't cry. She stood with her hand flat against her chest over the folded document for a long moment. "He knew," she said. "Yes. He knew they were coming for him, and he had time to hide this, but not time to—" She stopped. "He chose the evidence over the escape," Caleb said. "Because without the evidence, nothing changes. That is either very brave or very foolish." "Usually both," Caleb said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were steady. Whatever she was feeling, she was holding it in a place that didn't interfere with her ability to function, which was something he recognized because he lived there himself. Daniel did the same thing, he said. He hid the ledger instead of taking it and running. He could have gotten out of the territory with it. He chose to stay and keep working because he thought staying would be more effective. He paused. I used to be angry about that he stayed. Now I think I understand it better. Do you? Hannah asked. No, he said after a moment. Not entirely, but better than I did. They spent the rest of the day working the ranch. Caleb cut timber for a new trough, while Hannah went through the remaining account books systematically, cross-referencing dates and making notes. He rebuilt the trough by afternoon and got it positioned and fed by the spring line before the heat peaked. She brought water and hard bread to where he was working without being asked. He ate it without sitting down, which she didn't comment on. In the late afternoon, a noise on the lower trail made them both go still. Not riders, a single horse. Moving slowly, cautiously, the way someone moves when they don't want to be mistaken for a threat. Caleb stepped to the side of the corral and watched. The rider was young, 17, maybe 18, on a spotted horse that was too good for his worn clothing. He stopped at the property line and called out, "Hello, the ranch. I ain't with Vane. I just need to talk." Caleb said nothing. Hannah came out of the cabin doorway. "Who are you?" "Owen Pike. I work at the livery in town." The boy dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible in the way someone does when they've been taught that lesson the hard way. "I know who you are, ma'am, and I know who he is." He glanced at Caleb and then quickly looked at Hannah instead, because looking at Caleb directly took more nerve than he currently had available. "I saw something the night of the explosion. 3 years ago. I was 14. I was mucking stalls at the mine stable, and I saw Vane's foreman carry a black ledger out of the mine office and put it in a wagon." The air around Caleb changed. Owen felt it apparently because he took a half step back before stopping himself. "I never told anybody," the boy said. "Because the foreman saw me see him, and he came over, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he told me that boys who talk about things that aren't their business have a way of getting lost in the mountains." He swallowed. "I've been keeping that in my chest for 3 years. I'm tired of keeping it." "The ledger," Caleb said, and his voice was very quiet. "Where did they take it?" "I don't know where they took it from there, but I know where the foreman went first. He went to the burned bridge, and I heard him tell the wagon driver to take the north track and wait." "Why are you telling us now?" Hannah asked. Owen looked at her. "Because yesterday I watched a woman stand up in the town square and question evidence that Silas Vane put in front of a sheriff he owned, and the woman was right, and nobody did anything about it except an old judge, and I thought—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought if she could do that with everybody watching, then maybe I could do this. With just you two watching." A long silence. Then Hannah said, "Come inside, Owen. I'll make coffee, and you can tell us everything you remember in whatever order it comes." Owen tied his horse and came through the gate. He gave Caleb a wide berth, which Caleb permitted without comment. Inside, sitting across the table from Hannah, with his hands wrapped around a cup, Owen told them the rest. The ledger had been removed before the fire department reached the mine. The foreman had specifically taken the safety assessment pages. Owen had seen the cover clearly. He'd also seen 2 other men follow the wagon up the north track before doubling back to report the fire. And then he told them something that changed the calculation entirely. "Vane's planning to divert the spring," he said. "I heard him talking to his engineer 3 days ago. He's got a crew ready. He said—" Owen hesitated. "He said once the water's redirected, the woman won't last a week, and they can take the deed without any trouble." Hannah set down her cup. "When?" Caleb said. 10 days, maybe less. He's waiting to see if you'll leave on your own first." 10 days. Caleb looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Caleb. 10 days to find the ledger, gather the evidence, protect the spring, and get everything before the circuit judge, before Vane could make the ranch uninhabitable. "We need to move faster," Hannah said. "Yes," Caleb said. "The burned bridge, we need to go. We need to plan it first. If Vane has men watching the north trail, then we find another way up. There is another way. It's harder." "How much harder?" He looked at her. "It requires a full day's riding a rope descent into the gorge, and we should go before dawn to avoid being seen." "All right." She turned to Owen. "Can you ride back without being followed?" "I think so. I said I was going to a ranch west of town to look at a horse. I do that sometimes." "Good. Go back. Act normal. If you can find out anything about Vane's timeline for the diversion, find a way to get word to us." She paused. "Owen, what you did today, it took real courage." The boy looked at the table. "It didn't feel like courage. It felt like I couldn't carry it anymore." "That's usually what courage is," Hannah said. After Owen rode out, Hannah cleared the table and got out the lamp and the account notes and began organizing what they had into the sequence they would need for a formal legal presentation. Caleb worked the numbers on the opposite side of the table, mapping the known facts against the timeline of the explosion. They worked opposite each other in silence for an hour. Then Hannah said without looking up, "You're good at this." "At what?" "Seeing the pattern. I give you a fact and you place it correctly without me explaining the context." "Daniel and I used to do his children's arithmetic together," Caleb said. He didn't elaborate. She glanced up briefly, then back to her papers. Later, she found him outside in the dark, sitting against the wall of the cabin, with a small piece of wood and a knife working at something in the low light from the window. She stopped in the doorway. "What are you making?" she asked. He turned the piece so she could see it. A horse. Small detailed, the legs just beginning to take shape from the block. "I made them for Daniel's children," he said. "Before." He turned it back. "I still make them. I don't know why." Hannah was quiet for a moment. "I know why," she said. He looked up. "Because you're still the person who made them," she said. "And that part of you has been waiting out 3 years of very hard living, and it's still here." She paused. "That's not nothing, Caleb." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the horse. She went inside. He sat in the dark and worked the knife and thought about Daniel's youngest, who would be 7 years old now, and thought about a burned bridge with an iron box beneath it, and thought about a woman who had ridden into a town square in dirty boots and cited a territorial provision from memory and changed the entire shape of the day. Then he put the horse in his coat pocket, settled his back against the cabin wall, and watched the trail below. Nothing moved. Above the ridge, the stars burned in the hot mountain dark, and in 10 days or less, Silas Vane intended to cut the water and take back everything, and the only thing standing between that outcome and a different one was 2 people who had met that morning, and a 17-year-old boy who had finally gotten tired of carrying someone else's secret. Caleb thought they had a chance. He was not certain it was a good one, but he had done more with less. They left before dawn. Caleb had them packed and moving while the stars were still out before the heat came back and before anyone watching the lower trail could get positioned ahead of them. Hannah had slept 4 hours. He knew because he'd heard her breathing change through the cabin wall. 4 hours was enough. It had to be. Owen had sent word the previous evening through Ruth Bell, a folded note tucked inside a bill of sale for horse feed that Ruth had brought out personally on the pretext of asking whether the new ranch owner needed boarding recommendations. The note said 3 words, 7 days now. Vane had moved his timeline up. Caleb hadn't told Hannah about the note until they were already an hour up the north trail, because he'd needed her focused on the riding and not on the recalculation of everything they were up against. When he finally told her, she was quiet for a full minute. Then she said, "How far to the bridge?" 6 hours at this pace. Less if the upper crossing is passable. Is it passable? It was 2 years ago. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. She urged her horse forward and didn't complain about the pace again. The alternate route he'd chosen cut through a high meadow and dropped into the gorge from the northwest side, which meant anyone watching the main bridge access from the south wouldn't see them coming. It also meant the descent was steeper and the footing less certain, and about 2 hours into the ride, Hannah's horse put a foot wrong on a loose shale section, and she had to dismount and lead it across by hand, which she did without hesitation, moving carefully and talking to the animal in a low, steady voice that kept it calm. Caleb dismounted too, and took position at the horse's hindquarters to prevent it sliding back. When they got across, Hannah looked at the shale section they'd just crossed and then looked at him. "You knew that was there," she said. "I knew something like it was there. That section changes every spring." "And you brought us this way anyway." The other way had 3 men on it by yesterday evening. Owen's note mentioned riders on the south approach. He met her look. This was the better risk. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she took her horse's reins and kept moving, which was as close to a concession as he expected to get from her and was in his estimation exactly appropriate. The gorge opened below them 3 hours later. The burned bridge was a stark thing, even now 3 years after the fire. Half of it still stood on the north side. The supports there had been stone rather than timber and had survived, but the center span had collapsed completely, and the south section had burned down to the waterline. What remained jutted out over the gorge like a broken jaw. Caleb studied it from above for a long time before moving. The iron box Daniel had described in his last letter would be wedged beneath the remaining north support below the waterline in a natural rock shelf. The water at this point in the summer was low, lower than it had been in years, which was both good and bad. Good because the box would be accessible. Bad because the gorge floor was dry enough to burn fast if someone wanted it to. He uncoiled the rope from his saddle. "I go down," he said. "You stay up here with Owen and watch the south approach." Owen, who had met them at the agreed point 2 hours back and said almost nothing, since stood at Hannah's shoulder and nodded with the eagerness of someone grateful to have a task that didn't require descending into a gorge. "How long do you need?" Hannah asked. 20 minutes, maybe less. "And if someone comes before 20 minutes, then you make noise. Any kind of noise, doesn't matter what." He tied the rope to the largest intact stone support. "I'll hear it." Hannah positioned herself where she could watch both the south trail and the edge of the gorge simultaneously. Owen moved to her left and slightly forward, which Caleb noted approvingly. The boy had chosen the better sightline without being told to. Caleb went over the edge. The descent was straightforward. He'd done worse on logging work in his 20s, and the rock face below the bridge was solid. He moved hand over hand down the rope and found the shelf exactly where Daniel's letter had described it. A natural horizontal crack in the gorge wall, wide enough to fit a man's forearm, running back about 18 inches into the stone. He reached in. His fingers found iron. The box was heavier than he'd expected, packed tight properly, sealed the latch rusted but intact. He got his arm around it and pulled it free and tucked it against his body and began climbing back up. He was halfway up when Hannah's voice came down, not loud, controlled, but urgent. "Caleb, south approach." He climbed faster. He came over the edge with the box under his arm and took one look at the south trail and understood immediately that they were out of time. 4 riders, possibly 5. Moving fast, no attempt at concealment, which meant they didn't care about being seen, and that was its own category of bad news. Vane was in front. Caleb hadn't expected that. Vane was the kind of man who sent people rather than came himself. The fact that he was here meant he considered this important enough to be personally present, for which meant he also considered it important enough to ensure it ended in a particular way. Hannah had the box out of Caleb's arm and was already lifting the latch. "Don't open it here," Caleb said. "I need to know what's in it." "You know what's in it. Open it in front of a judge, not in front of him." He closed his hand over hers on the latch. She looked up. "If he sees you've opened it, he knows what you've read. Right now, he doesn't know what we have." She held his gaze for half a second. Then she passed the box to Owen and said, "Inside your shirt. Don't let go of it regardless of what happens." Owen pressed the box against his ribs and buttoned his jacket over it with shaking hands. Vane pulled up 20 feet from them. His 4 men spread to either side in the practiced formation of people who have done this kind of thing before. 2 had rifles out. 2 had hands on their sidearms. "Mr. Mercer," Vane said. He looked at Caleb with the calm of a man who has arranged things to his satisfaction. "I expected this eventually. I didn't expect the company." He looked at Hannah. "Mrs. Mercer, I hoped you'd have the sense to stay at the ranch." "I go where the work is," Hannah said. Vane let his gaze move to Owen. The boy went very still. "Owen, Ike," Vane said pleasantly. I thought I saw your horse on the upper trail yesterday. I told myself I must be mistaken. You're a sensible boy." "He is," Hannah said. "Sensible enough to remember what he saw 3 years ago." Vane's pleasantness didn't move. That was the thing about Vane. His expression was a facade so practiced it had become its own kind of truth, and it was very difficult to find the edge of it. "I don't know what stories you've been filling his head with." "He filled his own head," Hannah said. "He saw your foreman remove a ledger from the mine office the night of the explosion. He's prepared to testify to that." Children's memories are unreliable. How was 14? Old enough to muck stalls, and old enough to remember a man telling him that boys who talk about things that aren't their business get lost in the mountains. Hannah kept her voice level. He remembered the exact phrasing. For 3 years. Something shifted in Vane's expression then. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional adjustment of the jaw, but Caleb caught it because he'd been watching Vane's face, the way you watch a sky that's considering a storm. Vane knew the phrasing was specific enough to be credible. "I'll make this simple," Vane said. "Give me whatever you found under that bridge. Sign the ranch deed over to my land company. Take the boy and leave the territory, and I give you my word, no charges will be filed against your husband for the assault on my guards." "The charges against my husband were already transferred to the circuit court," Hannah said. "And the assault evidence was fabricated. We have the shipping dates. Courts can be persuaded." "So can people," Hannah said. "That's rather the point of what we're doing here." Vane looked at her for a long moment with something that might in a different man have been respect. In Vane, it was merely the recalculation of an obstacle. "Set fire to the bridge supports," he said without raising his voice or changing his expression. One of his men swung off his horse with a torch already lit. He'd been carrying it under his coat prepared, which meant this had been part of the plan from the beginning, and moved toward the remaining north support. "Stop," Hannah said. Nobody stopped. Caleb. He was already moving. He crossed the distance to the man with the torch in 4 strides, and got his hand on the man's wrist before the torch reached the dry timber. The man was big, and he fought back hard, and they went down together in a crash of elbows and leverage, the torch skidding across the ground. One of Vane's other men came off his horse, and Caleb took a rifle stock across the shoulder that knocked him sideways, but didn't take him down. Hannah caught the torch before it rolled to the timber edge. The second man hit Caleb from the side, and the 3 of them struggled in a knot that was mostly Caleb holding 2 grown men far enough from the torch and the bridge to prevent disaster, which cost him considerably in terms of the cuts and blows he was absorbing without being able to fully defend against. Owen pressed back against the gorge wall with the box under his shirt, and did not move, which was exactly what he'd been told to do. Vane drew his revolver. "That's enough," he said. Caleb released the 2 men and straightened. His face was bleeding from a cut above his cheekbone, same side as the one that had been bleeding in the town square yesterday, which struck him with a grim private irony. His shoulder where the rifle had hit was going to be significant by morning. He breathed carefully and stood still and looked at Vane. "You've been holding back," Vane said, studying him. "You could have put those 2 men through the bridge railing. Why didn't you?" "Because putting men through bridge railings doesn't get the ledger in front of a judge," Caleb said. Vane seemed to find this genuinely interesting. He tilted his head slightly. "You're smarter than the stories I've told about you." "The stories you've told about me are exactly as smart as you needed them to be," Caleb said. "Fair," Vane said. He moved the revolver slightly, indicating Hannah. "Give me the box." "We don't have it," Hannah said. Vane looked at her. Then he looked at Owen. Owen's jacket was buttoned to the throat in August heat. Vane started toward him. And that was the moment Hannah moved not toward Vane, but toward Vane's horse, which was standing untended 6 feet to her left. She put herself between Vane and Owen in the same motion, and when Vane brought the revolver around to point at her, she said, "Elias Whitaker." Vane stopped. "You knew him," she said. "Not as a transaction. You knew him as a man. He sat across a table from you. He kept accounts you asked him to review before you understood what he was doing with the information. He was careful, and he was quiet, and he did not make enemies, and you killed him anyway." Her voice did not waver. "I want you to say his name." Miss Whitaker. Mrs. Mercer. And I want you to say his name." Vane looked at her with those flat, careful eyes. "What you want," he said, "is irrelevant to what happens next." "Maybe," Hannah said, "but I want the record to show that you looked at me and understood exactly what you did before the circuit court gets that record." "There won't be a circuit court." "Sheriff Rusk," said a voice from the South Trail. Everyone turned. Amos Rusk sat on his horse at the edge of the clearing, and he was alone, and his face had the look of a man who has spent a long night making a decision and come out the other side of it exhausted but committed. He had his badge on. He had his rifle across his saddle, and he was pointing the rifle not at Caleb Mercer, but at Silas Vane. Vane went very still. "Amos," he said. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. What was left was something harder and colder. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 3 years ago," Rusk said. He sounded tired, just deeply comprehensively tired. "I got your message this morning, the one saying you needed me out here." I wrote out. "Then I thought about why you needed me out here specifically, and what you were planning to do with a witness, and a woman, and that boy, and I thought—" He stopped, worked his jaw. "I thought I didn't want to be the man who helped you do it." "You owe me $11,000, Vane said. "I know what I owe you." "You owe me $11,000, and your badge and your pension, and if you point that rifle at me for another 5 seconds, I will collect every cent of it." "Maybe so," Rusk said. "But right now I've got the rifle, and you've got 4 men who I've known for 15 years, and I'm asking them directly." He raised his voice slightly, addressing Vane's riders. "Are you prepared to shoot a sheriff in the territory of Colorado so Silas Vane can destroy evidence in a mine disaster case?" A long silence. 2 of the riders looked at each other. One of them lowered his rifle. Vane turned on them. "Don't you dare!" The second man lowered his. "God damn it," Vane said. The remaining 2, the ones who'd been wrestling with Caleb, hesitated, then followed. Vane stood with the revolver still in his hand, and for the first time, Caleb saw the calculation behind his eyes running out of outcomes it liked. He was still weighing it, still looking for the angle. A man like Vane never fully stopped looking for the angle. "It's over," Rusk said. "Silas, it's done." "Not without the evidence," Vane said. And he turned faster than a man his age should have been able to, and he lunged toward Owen. Caleb caught him. I didn't think about it. Vane was in motion, and the boy was against the wall, and Caleb's body made the decision before his mind did, which was the way most of his best and worst moments had worked. He hit Vane at full weight, and they went down hard, near the gorge edge, and the revolver went somewhere in the impact, and they struggled in the dust and the dry heat, with the gorge falling away 2 feet from them. Vane got a hand free and drove his elbow into Caleb's wounded shoulder. The pain was significant. It went white and total for 1 second, and in that second, Vane twisted and got partially free and found the revolver with his right hand and brought it around. Caleb had Vane's wrist. Vane had the revolver. They were both on the edge of the gorge, and Vane's left hand was braced on the broken bridge timber, which was crumbling, and Caleb could see in his face that Vane understood he was about to go over. He understood it the way Caleb had understood it, standing under the rope yesterday morning, with that particular quality of awareness that comes when a person suddenly finds the outcome very real. Caleb held Vane's wrist. The revolver was pointed sideways now away from both of them, forced there by simple leverage. Vane looked up at him, and Caleb thought about Daniel. He thought about it with the full weight of 3 years, 12 dead men, a burned bridge, 2 men who'd beaten him in the town square, a rope over a cottonwood tree, and 11,000 words he'd tried to say in every sheriff's office between Red Hollow and the territorial capital and never been allowed to finish. He thought about all of it, and he reached down with his free hand and pulled Vane back from the edge. He stood up. He let Vane's wrist go. He stepped back. Vane sat in the dust at the gorge edge with the revolver loose in his hand, breathing hard, looking up at Caleb with an expression that was not gratitude. It wasn't remotely gratitude, but was something Caleb hadn't seen on Vane's face before. Confusion. Genuine confusion. The kind that comes when a situation doesn't follow the rules you've built your understanding of the world around. "You don't get to turn me into your final lie," Caleb said. He turned to Rusk. Rusk had the handcuffs out already, which meant he'd prepared for this, which meant he'd ridden out here with the intent to use them, which meant at some point in the night, Amos Rusk had chosen, and Caleb was not going to make any assessment of that choice right now except that it was the right one, and it had cost the man something real to make it. "I'll need your assistance," Rusk said. He was looking at the handcuffs with some difficulty. His left arm, Caleb noticed, had a bloom of red through the shirt that hadn't been there a minute ago. One of the two shots that had been fired in the general chaos had found him. Caleb crossed the clearing and took the handcuffs from Rusk's hand. He placed them on Silas Vane himself, who did not resist. Then, Hannah was at Rusk's side with both hands pressing flat against the wound and saying something Caleb couldn't hear over the blood in his ears, and Rusk was telling her it wasn't as bad as it looked, and Caleb looked at Owen, who was still against the wall, still had the box under his shirt, still had his jacket buttoned, and was staring at all of them with the expression of someone who has just watched several things happen at once and has not yet sorted them into the correct order. "Owen," Caleb said. "Yes, sir." "You did well." The boy exhaled like he'd been holding that breath since they'd left the ranch. The burning had not happened. Vane's man had dropped the torch in the first struggle, and Caleb had kicked it clear without registering. Doing so, he found it later at the edge of the gorge, burned out in the dirt. The bridge supports were intact. The evidence was intact. The sheriff was wounded, but standing, which Rusk seemed to be managing through force of will rather than any comfortable biological process. Hannah had the wound packed with cloth torn from her petticoat and was telling Rusk with great specificity exactly how he was going to remain conscious until they could get him to a doctor, and Rusk was nodding in the submissive way of a man who has learned that arguing with this particular type of person is not an efficient use of anyone's time. Caleb went to the gorge edge and looked down. He stayed there for the moment, looking at the burned-out remains of the south span, the low summer water below it, the rock shelf where the iron box had sat for 3 years. Daniel had put it there. Daniel had climbed down into that gorge and wedged it in the dark and climbed back up and then gone back to his work and been killed 6 months later. Caleb put his hand against the remaining stone support of the bridge. The stone was hot from the sun and rough under his palm, and he stayed like that for just a moment with his eyes on the gorge and the ruins. Then Hannah's hand touched his arm. He turned. She looked at him for a moment, at the blood on his face, the way he was holding his shoulder, the look in his eyes that she had not seen before and would not name incorrectly, because she had read him well enough by now to know what grief wore when it was trying to hold its shape in public. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything about Daniel or the bridge or 3 years or 12 men. She said, "Rusk needs to get down the mountain. Can you take his horse's lead?" "Yes," he said. "Owen has the box. I'll ride with Rusk." She paused. "Caleb." He looked at her. "You pulled him back," she said. "From the edge." "Yes." "That was the hardest thing you did today." He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. She'd said it the way you say things that don't need a response, that simply need to be witnessed by the person they're said to. She went back to Rusk. Caleb untied his horse and brought it alongside Rusk's, looping the lead. Vane's men had gone. The two who'd lowered their rifles first were helping steady Rusk's horse, and the other two were sitting in the dirt near Vane, not escaping, not causing trouble, with the look of men who have completed a calculation and don't like the answer. "You two," Caleb said to them. They looked at him with the wariness of people who expect to be hit. "You're going to ride ahead and tell whoever's in Red Hollow that the sheriff is injured and needs a doctor. You're going to do it because it's the right thing to do. And because when this goes before the circuit court, the difference between the men who cooperated and the men who didn't will matter." He held their gaze. "Go." They went. Vane watched from the dust with his hands cuffed and his expression closed. He said as Caleb mounted, "You're going to find that courts move slowly, that witnesses change their minds, that ledgers get misinterpreted, that money has a longer memory than justice." "Maybe," Caleb said. "But we have the ledger, the accounts, Owen's testimony, the sheriff's testimony, and the shipping dates on those crates." He looked down at Vane. "And we have the full day you spent planning to destroy it all, which tells any judge exactly how important it is." He kicked his horse forward. They came down off the mountain in the late afternoon, the sun pressing on their backs. The town of Red Hollow spread below them in the heat and the dust, and Hannah rode on Rusk's left and kept one hand on his arm to steady him, and Owen rode with the iron box in his lap, with both arms around it like it might try to escape. Caleb rode at the front. He rode into Red Hollow, the way he had not ridden into a town in 3 years, not hunched, not along the back alleys, not scanning for exits. He rode down the center of the main street with Amos Rusk beside him, and the people who came out of the buildings to look did not immediately see a monster. They saw a wounded sheriff. They saw a woman keeping him upright. They saw a boy with something important pressed to his chest. And then they saw Caleb Mercer, and some of them still flinched, but some of them didn't. Ruth Bell came out of the boarding house at a pace that was nearly running, and she took one look at Rusk's arm and said, "Get him inside, I've got supplies." And then she looked at Caleb and said, "Is it done?" "Not yet," he said, "but closer." "Yes." She nodded once with the decisive efficiency of a woman who has been waiting 3 years for closer and knows exactly what to do with it when it arrives. Hannah helped Rusk down and into the boarding house, and Caleb secured the horses, and Owen Pike sat on the boarding house step with the iron box in his lap and looked at the town around him with the slightly dazed expression of someone who left this morning as a scared stable boy and has returned as something else but hasn't decided yet what that something else is called. Caleb sat next to him on the step. Owen didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "Will it work, all of it? Will a judge actually—" "I don't know," Caleb said. Owen looked at him. He'd expected reassurance, and the honest answer took him a moment to process. "But the evidence is real," Caleb continued. "The ledger is real. Your testimony is real. Ruth's testimony. Rusk's statement. Hannah's uncle's record." He put his elbows on his knees. "Real evidence in front of a real court is not a guarantee, but it's the only thing that gives justice an actual chance. The alternative is doing nothing, which guarantees a different outcome." Owen looked at the box. "Daniel Mercer hid this." "Yes." "He believed somebody would come for it." "Yes." "Did he know it would take 3 years?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't think he knew that." Owen nodded slowly. He held the box out to Caleb. Caleb took it. He held it for a long moment, and the iron was warm from the boy's body heat, and rough from 3 years of moisture and mineral, and somewhere inside it was Daniel's handwriting on pages that would tell the truth to a court of law, if a court of law was willing to hear it. The door of the boarding house opened, and Hannah came out. She looked at the two of them on the step. She sat on Caleb's other side without asking whether the space was available. "Rusk is stable," she said. "He'll need a few days, but he's already told Ruth everything he's prepared to say to the judge." She paused. "The circuit judge arrives in 4 days." 4 days, Caleb said. "We need to keep the spring protected until then. Vane's engineer is still in town, and his crew still has the equipment." She looked at the box in Caleb's hands. "We need that evidence formally secured with the judge's office before Vane can get word to his lawyers." "I know. I also need to tell you something." He turned to look at her. Her face had the quality it got when she was about to say something that had been building for a while and had finally reached the point where holding it back cost more than saying it. "When Vane went for Owen," she said, "and you moved, you didn't think about it. There was no calculation. You just moved between him and the boy." "Yes. That's who you actually are," she said. "Whatever Vane spent 3 years telling this town, whatever you spent 3 years believing about yourself." She looked at the box and then back at him. "That's the real version." He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. She'd learned his silences well enough to know which ones meant he'd heard something and was holding it in a place where it might actually have room to matter. The sun was going down over the western ridge, and Red Hollow was loud with the news of what had come down off the mountain. And somewhere in the town, Silas Vane was sitting in the jail that had held Caleb yesterday, with his hands cuffed and his certainty running out through the cracks, and the circuit judge was 4 days away. 4 days. Caleb stood up. "We need to get back to the ranch tonight," he said. "The spring." "I know," Hannah said, standing beside him. I already told Owen. Owen was already on the horses. Caleb looked at Red Hollow, the street, the buildings, the people watching from doorways, with the complicated expressions of those who are discovering that the story they've been told doesn't fit the facts they're now looking at. He looked at all of it. Then he put the iron box under his arm and walked toward the horses, and Hannah walked beside him, and neither of them looked back at the hanging tree. They rode back to the ranch in the dark and found it standing. That was the first thing Caleb checked. Caleb checked not the house, not the spring, not whether Vane's engineer had come while they were gone. He checked the horses in the corral, the water in the channel, the gate latch on the upper pasture. All of it intact, all of it exactly as they'd left it. He stood in the yard for a moment and breathed. Hannah came out of the cabin with a lamp. She'd gone straight inside to check the hidden tin under the granite marker, the copies of Elias's statement, the backup documents. Still there. She'd repacked them and reset the stone and come back, and now she stood in the doorway watching Caleb stand in the yard and breathe. It's all right, she said. For tonight, he said. For tonight is enough. He came inside. They set the iron box on the table between them. Caleb had not opened it, had carried it down the mountain and through Red Hollow and back up the trail with the latch untouched, which had taken more discipline than anything else he'd done that day. Because what was inside it had been the only thing he'd wanted in the world for 3 years, and he'd needed to wait. Hannah looked at him across the table. Together, she said. He opened the latch. The ledger was wrapped in oilcloth inside the box, same as Elias's copies had been wrapped under the stone cautious men thought alike. Caleb unfolded the cloth with hands that were steadier than he expected them to be and laid the book flat on the table. He recognized the cover immediately. Black leather red binding tape on the spine, the mine company's stamp on the lower right corner. He had seen this book in the mine office dozens of times. He had watched the foreman carry it under his arm every Friday when the safety reports were due. He opened it to the first marked page and read. Hannah read beside him, leaning in without touching him her shoulder, just close enough that he was aware of the warmth of it. She was faster than him, her eyes moving in the organized pattern of someone trained to extract information from columns and rows. She'd find the significant entries before he did, and tap the page with one finger, and he'd read that section, and then they'd move together to the next. The ledger documented everything Daniel had described in his final letter. Material orders for support. Timbers. The specifications listed were standard grade, correctly priced, correctly noted on the official purchase record. But adjacent to each entry in a second column, using a different notation system, were the actual purchase amounts, lower grade, lower cost, and the name of the company that had supplied the inferior material. The difference between the official cost and the actual cost, multiplied across 18 months of purchases, represented a number that made Hannah stop reading for a moment. $43,000, she said. He pocketed $43,000 by buying rotten timber and filing for the good price. And when the bridge failed, Caleb said, he blamed the construction crew, which was Daniel's crew. Which was your crew originally. I'd been off that contract for 4 months, but my name was on the original bid documents, and Vane made certain that's what people remembered. Hannah turned to the next marked section. This one contained the inspector's payment records, not labeled as bribes, logged as consulting fees to a company that, as far as Caleb could determine, did not exist outside of this ledger. He invented a company to pay the bribes through, Hannah said. So the mine's own accounting records showed legitimate business expenses, Caleb said. Anyone auditing the books would have seen consulting fees, not payments to an inspector. But the inspector's name is still here. Daniel wrote it in the margin. In pencil. He must have cross-referenced the consulting company name against territorial business registrations and found it wasn't registered. Caleb touched the margin note. The handwriting was small and precise and entirely familiar. He was thorough. Hannah looked at the pencil note for a moment. She didn't say anything. She understood by now that she didn't need to say anything when there was a moment that required quiet. They worked through the rest of the ledger in just under 2 hours. When they finished, Hannah organized the pages with the account copies from beneath the stone and the shipping date records she'd been keeping since the first day, and she laid the full sequence out on the table and walked through it aloud, the way she said she used to practice testimony with her father. "The ledger proves the inferior materials," she said, moving through the sequence with her finger. "Elias's records prove the illegal water usage. Owen's testimony places the ledger removal at the night of the explosion. Rusk's statement confirms he was paid to suppress Caleb's reports. The shipping marks prove the explosives weren't in Caleb's possession before his arrest. And Vane's own behavior at the bridge." She paused. His admission that Elias's death was not an accident witnessed by Owen, Caleb, and a wounded sheriff is the piece that ties intent to outcome. "He didn't quite admit it directly," Caleb said. "He said Elias learned the hard way that Red Hollow was his town. In response to my direct question about a death officially listed as a riding accident." She looked at him. "A circuit court judge will understand what that sentence means." Caleb looked at the organized evidence on the table. 3 years. This was what 3 years looked like, laid flat on a table in a ranch cabin at midnight. Pages, dates. Columns of numbers. A dead man's margin notes in pencil, a 17-year-old's recollection, a sheriff's belated conscience. It was both more and less than he'd imagined. More because seeing it assembled made it real in a way that carrying it alone inside his chest never had. Less because it was still just paper, and paper had to survive lawyers and delays, and men who had reasons to want it to disappear. "The judge arrives in 4 days," he said. "3 now," Hannah said. She was looking at the window, which had gone from dark to the particular shade of gray that preceded dawn without him noticing. "It's past midnight." He had not slept. She had not slept. They had been working for, he calculated, approximately 22 hours straight, excluding the 4 hours she'd taken the night before. "You should rest," he said. "So should you." "I'll keep watch." "Caleb." She said his name in the particular tone she'd developed over 3 days, the one that meant she was about to say something factually accurate that he was not going to enjoy hearing. "Vane is in the Red Hollow jail. His men are either in custody gone or unwilling to act without him standing behind them. The engineer doesn't have authority to move on the spring without Vane's direct order. There is no immediate threat in the next 5 hours." She paused. "Sleep. I need you functional tomorrow." He looked at her. "I need us both functional," she said. He slept. He woke 2 hours later to the sound of hoofbeats on the lower trail, and he was on his feet with his knife out before he was fully conscious. And then he heard Ruth Bell's voice calling up from the gate, and he put the knife away and woke Hannah with a word. Ruth had ridden out in the pre-dawn dark on a horse that was too old for that kind of travel, which meant what she was carrying was urgent. She came through the cabin door with the particular purposeful energy of a woman who has been awake all night doing things that needed doing. "Vane's lawyer arrived from Denver," she said before she'd fully sat down. "He rode in at midnight. He's already filed a motion with the town clerk claiming the arrest was improper because Rusk was acting outside his authority in arresting his own employer." Hannah looked at Caleb. "Can he do that?" Owen asked. He'd slept in the small back area of the cabin and emerged at Ruth's voice, looking startled and young. "Not successfully," Hannah said. "Rusk wasn't acting as Vane's employee when he made the arrest. He was acting as sheriff. But the motion will create delay, which is the point." She looked at Ruth. "What else?" "Vane's engineer left town this morning, headed north." Ruth folded her hands in her lap. "With 3 wagons." The spring. Caleb was already at the door. "How long ago?" he said. 2 hours, maybe less. I came as fast as I could." 2 hours, 3 wagons. The route to the Upper Spring diversion point was longer by the main trail, longer than the cut route Caleb knew, but 3 wagons couldn't take the cut route. "If they left 2 hours ago by the main trail," he said, working it, "they're still 40 minutes from the diversion point." "We can get ahead of them," Hannah said. She was already putting on her boots. "Not with wagons. On horseback, yes." "What do we do when we get there?" Owen asked. "We stand between them and the spring," Hannah said, "and we make it very clear that any interference with the water channel is interference with private property under an active territorial deed." She looked at Caleb. "And we make sure they understand that we have documentation of everything, and that the circuit judge arrives in 3 days, and that anyone who acts on Vane's orders today will be named in the formal complaint." They're not going to care about a complaint, Owen said. No, Hannah agreed. But they'll care about Caleb. Caleb looked at her. You're intimidating, she said simply. Use it. They rode hard. Caleb took the cut route and pushed both horses faster than was entirely safe, and Hannah kept up without complaint, and Owen followed on his spotted horse, with his jaw set and his eyes on the trail. The morning heat was already building. It was going to be another brutal day, and the dry air tasted like dust and distance. They reached the upper spring diversion point, with 15 minutes to spare. Caleb positioned himself in the center of the trail. Hannah and Owen flanked him on either side, slightly behind, which was not what he'd intended, but was clearly what she'd decided. The engineer's wagons came around the north bend and stopped. The engineer was a compact man named Ferris, who wore his professionalism like armor. He looked at the three people blocking the trail, and then looked specifically at Caleb and went through an internal calculation that was visible on his face. Mr. Mercer, Ferris said. I have a work order signed by Silas Vane, Caleb said, who is currently in the Red Hollow jail. Ferris paused. The work order is signed, he said, but with slightly less certainty. Mrs. Mercer, Hannah said, urging her horse forward one step so she was level with Caleb. Hannah Mercer, this spring is on Whitaker Ranch, which is my deeded property. Any diversion of this water channel without a court order is interference with property rights under territorial law, and I will have your name, your company name, and the names of every man in those wagons in front of the circuit judge in 3 days. She reached into her coat and produced a folded document. This is a copy of the deed. This is the spring survey my uncle filed in 1874. And this is a letter I wrote this morning addressed to the Territorial Land Commissioner, describing this diversion attempt, which Ruth Bell is currently carrying to the telegraph office in Red Hollow. She didn't have the last document. Ruth was already back at the boarding house resting her horse. But Ferris didn't know that. Ferris looked at the documents. He looked at Caleb. He looked at his wagons, at the men in them, and then back at Caleb again. I'll need to consult with, he began. Vane is unavailable, Caleb said. You know that. His lawyer filed a procedural motion at midnight that will not be resolved before the circuit judge arrives, Hannah said. Which means for the next 3 days, there is no legal authority ordering this diversion. Which means if you proceed on your own judgment with your own name attached. A long silence. Pack it up, Ferris said to his men. The wagons turned around. Caleb let out a slow breath. Owen made a sound beside him that was something between a laugh and a gasp. She bluffed him, he said very quietly. She gave him an accurate legal analysis, Caleb said. The letter to the land commissioner will be written and sent as soon as we get back, Caleb said. Owen looked at Hannah with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of what adults were capable of. She's something, he said. Yes, Caleb agreed. They rode back to the ranch, and Hannah wrote the letter to the land commissioner, and Caleb wrote it down to Ruth in the afternoon, and Ruth sent it by the afternoon telegraph. And then, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, there was nothing immediate to do. The ranch was intact. The spring was running. The evidence was secured. The judge was 3 days out. Caleb repaired the water trough that had been smashed on the first night, not because it was urgent, but because his hands needed work when his mind was running. He cut the boards and fitted the joints, and drove the pegs with steady, focused movements, and Hannah came and sat on the fence rail nearby with a cup of coffee and watched him without saying anything for a while. Then she said, "When this is over," he kept working, "and the judge has ruled, and the deed is confirmed, and Vane is in front of a court. What do you want?" He paused. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the question had not been asked of him in so long that his mind didn't know initially which direction to move in. "I want my brother's name cleared," he said. "It will be. The ledger does that. I want Daniel's children to know what he did, that he found the evidence and hid it, and it survived. He fitted the next board. I want Clara, his widow, to know he didn't die because of me." "She'll know," Hannah said. "I'll write to her myself if you want." He looked up at her. "I'm good at letters," she said. "My uncle taught me." She held his gaze. What else? He went back to the trough. He drove 3 pegs before answering. I don't know, he said. I've spent 3 years wanting one specific thing. I don't have a version of what comes after it. Hannah was quiet for a moment. I had that problem when I left Missouri, she said. I'd spent 2 years wanting to get out, and when I finally did, I was on a wagon headed west before I'd thought clearly about what I was headed toward. She looked at the mountains. Then my uncle left me this, and I had a destination, but the destination turned out to be more complicated than the map suggested. Most things are. Yes. She looked at him. You're good at this ranch. You know things about this land, the trail, the spring, the timber that would take most men years to learn. My uncle's deed covers a lot of ground, and there's more of it than I can manage alone. Caleb kept working. He kept his voice neutral. What are you saying? I'm saying that when the legal situation is resolved, the marriage is ours to do whatever we choose with, Hannah said. That's the honest truth, and I think you deserve to hear it plainly. Judge Cole married us under a legal provision. That provision served its purpose. What happens next is our decision, not the law's. He set down the hammer. He turned to look at her on the fence rail. If you want to leave, she said carefully, I will not make it difficult. You'll have whatever portion of the outcome you've earned, which is considerable, and I'll find a way to manage the ranch on my own terms. She paused. But if you want to stay. Hannah. She stopped. He said her name like he was placing it somewhere careful, like it was something he'd been carrying with a light grip because he hadn't been sure how long he'd be allowed to hold it. I haven't wanted to stay anywhere in 3 years, he said. I haven't let myself. He looked at the trough he'd been building. The morning after we arrived here, I woke up before dawn to check the trail, and when I came back and saw the lamp in the cabin window. He stopped. What? Hannah said. I thought that's a light someone left on for me. He said it quietly without ornamentation. I don't know how long it's been since I had that thought about a place. Hannah's hands were very still around her coffee cup. It was cold last night, she said. I left it burning so you could see the path back. I know, he said. That's what made it that thought and not a different one. The silence between them was the kind that had weight and warmth in it, that pressed in from both sides with the feeling of something that had been building across days of work and difficulty and honesty and was now at the point where it needed to be named, or it would start to cost them both something. Stay, Hannah said. Not a question, not a request. A statement offered plainly by a woman who had come to understand that plain statements cost less than elaborate ones and meant considerably more. Caleb picked up the hammer. I'll finish the trough, he said. And she understood what that meant because she'd been listening to him long enough to know that when Caleb Mercer answered a question with an action, the action was the answer. She stayed on the fence rail until he was done. They ate dinner that evening with Owen at the table, and Ruth arrived in the late afternoon having made the ride back up because she said she wasn't going to sit in town and wonder, and so there were 4 of them, and Ruth had brought provisions and a rhubarb pie that had survived the ride in a condition that was optimistic but genuine, and Owen ate 3 pieces without appearing to slow down at any point. Ruth told them what Red Hollow was saying. The town was divided but differently than before. Before the division had been believe vain or quietly suspect something was wrong, but say nothing. Now the division was accept what the evidence showed or resist it, because accepting it meant acknowledging complicity in what had been done to Caleb and to the men who died in that mine. Some people are already apologizing, Ruth said. Not to you, you're not there to apologize to, but to each other. Working themselves up to it. She looked at Caleb across the table. The 2 deputies who lowered their rifles at the bridge. One of them came to see me this afternoon. He asked if I thought you'd be willing to hear him out. What did you tell him? Caleb said. I told him I thought you'd listen, Ruth said. I wasn't certain about anything beyond that. Caleb thought about it. Tell him he can come, he said. Ruth nodded. There's something else, she said. She set down her fork. Vane's lawyer went to the jail this afternoon to consult, and while he was there he talked to Vane for a long time, and when he came out he went to the telegraph office. She looked at Hannah. I couldn't hear what he sent, But he was in there for 20 minutes. Calling for reinforcements, Owen said. Or for a different judge, Hannah said. Caleb looked at her. Vane has been operating in this territory for 15 years, she said. He's had time to cultivate relationships. If he knows the circuit judge who's coming. He doesn't know Judge Cole, Ruth said. Cole's been on the Eastern Circuit. He's only in this region because the regular judge took sick. She paused. But Vane's lawyer may not know that yet. He'll find out, Caleb said. Yes, but by then, the evidence will be in front of Cole and formally filed. Hannah looked at Caleb. We need to ride to Red Hollow tomorrow. Get everything officially filed with the court clerk before any motion can be made to redirect the case. Is it safe to go back? Owen asked. Safer than waiting, Caleb said. That night, after Ruth and Owen had settled and the lamp was burning low, Hannah came outside to where Caleb sat against the cabin wall. She sat beside him without asking. He'd gotten used to that, the way she moved into shared space without requiring permission, which was different from the way most people moved into shared space, which was either asking too much or taking without asking. She sat, and for a while they just listened to the night sounds of the mountain, the creek below the horses, something moving in the timber on the far ridge. My uncle wrote in his last letter that he'd never found the courage to fight Vane openly, Hannah said. He said he'd documented everything and hid everything and hoped someone else would fight the battle. He'd been too careful to fight himself. She was quiet for a moment. I used to think caution was cowardice. Now I think it was strategy. He kept the evidence alive until someone could come for it. He kept it until you came for it, Caleb said. We came for it, Hannah said. He didn't correct her. She leaned back against the cabin wall beside him, close enough that their shoulders were touching, and neither of them moved away from that, and neither of them commented on it, because some things didn't need commentary any more than a lamp left burning in a window needed explanation. The judge was 2 days out. The evidence was secured. The spring was running, and somewhere in a Red Hollow jail cell, Silas Vane was waiting for a message from his lawyer that would tell him whether he still had a path out of this, while two people sat in the dark against a cabin wall in the Colorado high country and said nothing and needed to say nothing and knew it. Tomorrow, they would ride back into town. Tomorrow, the real accounting would begin. But tonight, the mountain was quiet, and the lamp was on, and Caleb Mercer was exactly where he had told Hannah Whitaker he would be, and she was beside him, and that was enough. Not as a temporary condition, not as a legal arrangement serving its purpose, but as a fact that had put down roots somewhere in the last 4 days, and intended, if neither of them made the mistake of running from it, to stay. The circuit judge arrived on the morning of the third day, 2 hours earlier than expected, on a horse that looked like it had been ridden hard since before daylight. Judge Nathan Cole dismounted in front of the Red Hollow courthouse, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by the urgency of the things people need him for. And when Hannah came through the courthouse door to meet him with the iron box and 3 folders of organized documents, he looked at her and said, "Mrs. Mercer, I had a feeling when I left this town 4 days ago that things were going to be considerably more complicated when I returned." "Yes, sir," Hannah said. "They are, but I believe we've documented them thoroughly." Cole looked at the box. He looked at the folders. He looked at Caleb, who was standing at Hannah's shoulder, with the patience of a man who has learned that some things require waiting and has made his peace with that knowledge. "How long will it take me to review what you've brought?" Cole said. 2 hours, Hannah said. Possibly 3. "And the other party's counsel has filed one procedural motion that I believe you'll find without merit." Cole almost smiled. It was the same almost smile he'd shown in the town square when he'd confirmed the territorial provision. "All right," he said. "Let's begin." They went inside, and the truth, which had been waiting under a burned bridge for 3 years in an iron box wrapped in oilcloth, finally walked through a courthouse door in the full light of a Colorado summer morning, and sat down in front of a judge who had not been paid to look away. Judge Cole reviewed the evidence for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Caleb knew the exact duration because he sat on the bench outside the courthouse and counted the intervals between the church bell strikes, which was something he'd learned to do in the years when waiting was the only action available to him. Hannah sat beside him for the first hour, then stood and paced for 20 minutes, then sat again. Owen had positioned himself on the courthouse steps and was watching the street with the vigilance of someone who had recently discovered that watching the street was a skill that mattered. Ruth Bell arrived midway through the second hour with coffee she'd carried from the boarding house in a covered pot, which Caleb thought was one of the most practical acts of kindness he'd witnessed in recent memory. She poured without asking who wanted it, handed the first cup to Caleb, and sat beside Hannah on the bench. "Vane's lawyer went in there 20 minutes before you did," Ruth said low. Hannah's head came up. "He's in there now." Cole let him in to observe, not to speak. The lawyer tried to present the procedural motion first thing, and Cole set it aside without reading it. Ruth paused. "I heard that from the clerk." Cole apparently said he'd review procedural challenges after reviewing the evidence and not before. "Good," Hannah said. "The lawyer didn't look happy." "Good," Hannah said again. Caleb drank his coffee and said nothing and watched the courthouse door. The door opened at 11:47 by the church bell. The clerk came out first, then Vane's lawyer, whose expression had the tight, carefully controlled quality of a man who had lost something he'd expected to keep and was already constructing the appeal in his head. He looked at Caleb as he passed. He didn't say anything. He walked to the hotel at a pace that was not quite fast enough to be called fleeing. Then Judge Cole appeared in the doorway and looked at Hannah. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I'd like you and your husband inside, please." They went in. Cole had the evidence laid across the long table in the main chamber, organized annotated in his own hand at several points, with small strips of paper marking specific pages. He stood at the head of the table with his hands behind his back, and the expression of a man who has fully processed something and is now prepared to act on it without equivocation. "I've reviewed the company ledger, the water rights records, the shipping documentation, the signed statement from Sheriff Rusk, and the copies of your uncle's account files," he said. "I've also reviewed the formal complaint filed by Mr. Vane's attorney, which argues that the arrest was procedurally improper and that the evidence was obtained without lawful authority." He paused. "I'm going to address the attorney's motion first, because it shouldn't take long." Caleb watched Cole's face. "The arrest was made by a sitting sheriff in response to witnessed events," Cole said. "The evidence was recovered from private property by the property owner, which is Mrs. Mercer, and from a gorge adjacent to that property. No unlawful search was conducted. The motion is dismissed." He said it the way you say something that was never genuinely in question. "Now, to the substantive matters." Cole turned to the ledger. "The falsification of material records in this document represents fraud against the Red Hollow Mining Company's investors, against the Territorial Inspection System, and against the men who worked the mine under conditions the records show were known to be unsafe." He spoke precisely without drama, which made the words hit harder rather than softer. "The explosion that killed 12 workers in this mine 3 years ago was a foreseeable result of deliberate cost-cutting measures concealed through systematic falsification. This is not ambiguous. The ledger is not ambiguous." He looked at Caleb directly. "The charges previously alleged against Caleb Mercer: destruction of property, theft of company materials, conspiracy against mining operations are vacated. All of them. Effective immediately." He paused. "For the record, and because I believe it should be said plainly in a room where it can be documented, the evidence suggests that Mr. Mercer was reporting safety violations accurately and was systematically discredited to protect the men responsible for those violations. He was not treated justly by this community. He should have been." The room was very quiet. Caleb had imagined this moment in various forms across 3 years of mountain winters and failed attempts and doors that wouldn't open. He had imagined it as relief, as vindication, as something that would finally close a door that had been swinging open since the day of the explosion. What it actually felt like was quieter than that. More internal. Like a weight that had been pressing so long, it had become part of the architecture of how he stood, and now it was lifting, and the absence of it was going to take some time to understand. He breathed. Hannah's hand found his arm. Not dramatically. Just quietly at his side, her fingers closing around his forearm, the way someone takes hold of something they want to make sure is still there. "Silas Vane," Cole continued, will face formal charges on multiple counts, including criminal fraud, bribery of a public official, conspiracy to suppress testimony, and based on Sheriff Rusk's statement regarding the circumstances of Elias Whitaker's death. I am referring a separate inquiry to the Territorial Marshal's office regarding that matter. He looked at Hannah. I am sorry about your uncle, Mrs. Mercer. I believe he understood what he was preserving and chose to preserve it at considerable personal cost. Hannah said, yes, he did. The Whitaker Ranch deed, Cole said, is confirmed without challenge. The 90-day requirement is satisfied by continuous occupation and documented improvement. The spring water rights are registered under the deed as of today. No diversion may be ordered without a formal court proceeding, which will not be forthcoming given the current circumstances. He gathered the papers and set them in order. Are there questions? There were no questions. Cole extended his hand to Caleb. Caleb shook it. Cole said quietly enough that it was almost private. You were patient with this for a long time, Mr. Mercer. That kind of patience costs something. Yes, sir, Caleb said. It does. They walked out of the courthouse into the August heat, and Red Hollow was already different from what it had been when they'd walked in. Word moved fast in a town this size. The clerk had probably told 2 people on his way to the water pump, and those 2 had told 4 more, and now small clusters of people stood on the boardwalks with the particular body language of those who are discussing news that requires them to reconsider things they'd settled into believing. Some of them looked at Caleb with the new expression, not the old fear, not quite comfort yet, but the uncertain renegotiation happening in real time in their faces. One of the mining deputies from the bridge, the first one who had lowered his rifle, stepped off the boardwalk and put himself in Caleb's path. He was a broad man in his 40s named Cord, and he stood with his hat in his hands, which was not a posture that came naturally to him. Mr. Mercer, he said. I owe you. Cord, Caleb said. The man stopped. You lowered your rifle when it mattered, Caleb said. I saw it. He paused. That's the beginning of something better than what came before it. Don't waste it. Cord nodded. He couldn't quite find words. He stepped back and put his hat on and walked away with the slightly stunned look of a man who had prepared for a harder conversation and found something he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Owen had gone ahead to Ruth's boarding house to tell her the outcome, and Hannah was beside Caleb on the main street, and they walked together toward the boarding house without hurrying, and the town moved around them, not away from them, not quite toward them, but differently than before. Ruth was crying when they came through the door. Not the soft kind of crying, but the honest kind, the kind that comes from a place too long, held too tight, and she pressed her hands against Caleb's face. She was shorter than him by nearly 2 feet, and had to reach up to do it, and she said, My boy always knew it wasn't you. He said so. The morning of the blast he said Caleb Mercer is the one person who tried to stop this, and I am going to say that in front of every living soul in this territory, until someone listens. Caleb put his hands over hers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Ruth pulled him into an embrace that was fierce and brief and entirely maternal, and then she released him and straightened and said, Sit down, all of you, I have lunch. They sat. And that was the thing. Nobody had written into any of Caleb's imagined versions of this moment that what came after vindication, immediately after, was lunch at Ruth Bell's table with Owen eating too fast, and Hannah organizing the papers back into their folders, and Ruth moving between the kitchen and the table with a competence that made the whole thing feel less like a landmark moment and more like a Tuesday, and how that ordinariness was the most healing thing it could have possibly been. The afternoon brought 2 things Caleb had not anticipated. The first was a visit from 3 families whose men had died in the mine explosion. They came together, which told him they'd planned it, discussed it, agreed on it before coming. The Hadley family, the Pryor family, and a widow named Esther Morse, who had lost both a husband and a brother-in-law in the same blast. They knocked on Ruth's door, and Ruth let them in and looked at Caleb with a question in her expression, and he nodded. They sat across the table from him, and none of them seemed certain who should speak first, so Caleb spoke first. I know what you believed, he said. I'm not going to tell you that you were wrong to believe it, because Vane built the story well, and there was no counter-evidence available to you. I'm going to tell you what happened, and then I'm going to answer whatever you ask me, and you can decide what to do with the answers. He told them. All of it. The safety reports. The foreman's dismissals. His attempts to reach the territorial inspector the morning of the explosion when he'd been delivering timber to the north section and heard the collapse from a mile away and run back. He told them about finding Daniel. He told them about the days after when Vane's story had spread so fast and so completely that by the time Caleb could speak, no one would hear him. He did not minimize his part. "I should have done more," he said. "I filed the reports and I believed the inspection process would work, and I was wrong to believe that. I should have walked into that mine and told every man to leave and dealt with the consequences of that later." He said it the same way he'd said it to Hannah across the dinner table, flat and undeflected. "I carry that. That part is mine regardless of everything else." Esther Morse looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "My husband came home the night before the blast and told me a man named Mercer had filed the third safety report. He said at least somebody's trying." She folded her hands on the table. "I forgot that part for 3 years because it was easier to have someone to be angry at than to accept that a powerful man just decided their lives weren't worth the cost of good timber." The prior son 15, old enough to have carried this for 3 years, said, "Did it hurt when they beat you in town after?" Caleb looked at the boy. "Yes," he said. "Did you want to hurt them back?" "Yes." "Why didn't you?" "Because hurting them wouldn't have told the truth," Caleb said. "And the truth was the only thing that mattered." The boy nodded slowly. He was working something out behind his eyes. They left an hour later, not healed. That was going to take considerably longer than an afternoon, but with the weight redistributed. Grief that has an accurate shape to it is still grief, but it sits differently. It doesn't twist. The second thing Caleb hadn't anticipated arrived at Ruth's door in the early evening in the form of a telegram. Owen brought it from the telegraph office because he'd been passing by, and he handed it to Caleb with a look that said he didn't know what was in it, but could tell from the operator's expression that it mattered. Caleb read it. He read it twice. Then he sat very still for a moment with the paper in his hands. "What is it?" Hannah said. He passed it to her. She read it. Her expression shifted. Not alarm, something more complicated than alarm. Something that was trying to decide what it was. The telegram was from Clara Mercer, Daniel's widow. It had been sent from a town in Kansas where she'd settled with the children after the explosion. Received letter from Territorial Court, notifying of evidence clearing. Daniel's name. Stop. Received your letter. Mrs. Mercer, thank you, stop. Thomas and the girls want to know if they can come, stop. I need to hear it from Caleb, stop. Please respond, stop. Caleb stood up. He walked outside. Hannah gave him 3 minutes. Then she came out and stood beside him. Thomas is the youngest, Caleb said. He was 4 when Daniel died. He won't remember me. He'll know you, Hannah said. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It isn't. But it's a beginning. She paused. What are you afraid of? He didn't answer immediately. That I'll look at them, he said finally, and see Daniel looking back, and I won't. He stopped. You won't be able to hold it together, Hannah said. Yes, Caleb. She waited until he looked at her. Fall apart in front of Daniel's children. Let them see that their father mattered enough to break you a little. That is not weakness. That is the most honest thing you could give them. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he went back inside and wrote the telegram response himself. Clara, stop. Come, stop. There is room, stop. Caleb. He handed it to Owen, who ran it to the telegraph office, and then he sat back down at Ruth's table and put his elbows on his knees and his hands over his face, and stayed like that for a while, and nobody in the room, not Ruth, not Hannah, not Owen. When he came back, said a single word, because they understood that some processes need silence, the way wounds need air. When he came back up, his eyes were red at the edges, and his jaw was set, and his voice was entirely steady. We should get back to the ranch, he said. Yes, Hannah said. The north fence still needs 2 posts, and the channel junction needs to be reseeded before the weather turns. I know. And I told Owen I'd start teaching him the upper trail survey so he can manage the supply runs without needing me to. Caleb? Hannah said. He stopped. "We can do all of that," she said. "And we will. But first," she reached into her coat and produced a small thing which she set on the table between them. It was the wooden horse he'd carved on the first night, the one he'd put in his pocket, the one she'd seen him working on in the dark, and said the words that had stayed with him since. "You're still the person who made them. That part of you has been waiting out 3 years of very hard living, and it's still here. You left it on the windowsill this morning," she said. "I think you meant to bring it." He picked it up. He turned it in his hands, the small legs, the careful mane, the body he'd shaped from a scrap piece of pine in the dark, on the first night when he'd had no idea what the next morning would look like. "Thomas will want something to hold on to when he comes," Hannah said. "Something that tells him who you are before you have to find the words." He closed his hand around the horse. He nodded once. They rode back to the ranch in the long gold light of the late afternoon, and the mountains were the particular color they went in August, just before the sun dropped behind the western ridge, amber and deep shadow, and the kind of blue that only exists at altitude. Caleb rode ahead as he usually did on the steeper sections, and Hannah rode behind him, and Owen came last, and the three of them moved up the trail with the efficiency of people who have made this particular journey enough times to know where each other will be without looking. They worked through the evening. Caleb reset the north fence posts, while Hannah reconciled the final deed paperwork at the table. Owen cleaned the tack and organized the tool shed and managed to break one handle on a rake, which he confessed immediately, and which Caleb responded to by handing him the spare handle and showing him how to seat it properly, which was not the response Owen had been braced for, and which shifted something in the boy's posture, a small relaxation, a small claim on belonging. After dinner, Ruth had stayed through the evening and was reading in the corner chair that had apparently become her corner chair over the course of the week. Owen had gone to sleep in the back with the uncomplicated swiftness of the young and the recently exhausted. The ranch was quiet. Caleb came in from the last check of the horses and found Hannah on the porch step with a cup of tea, looking at the stars. He sat beside her, his place on the step, which had also become a fixed thing over the course of the week, in the way that places become fixed when people keep returning to them. 3 weeks until Clara comes, Hannah said. If the Kansas roads are clear, Caleb said, they'll manage. Thomas has never ridden more than a day's travel. He's Daniel's boy, Hannah said. He'll manage. Caleb looked at the stars. I want to rebuild the bridge, he said. The one above the gorge. Not the burned one that's too far gone. But there's a crossing point half a mile north where the gorge narrows. If I put a sound bridge there, the ranchers on the upper plateau have a direct route to town that cuts 2 days off the supply run. That's a significant project. It would take most of the fall. Owen could help. He's got good hands and he learns fast. He paused. I'd need to hire 2 more men for the heavy work. We can afford 2 men, Hannah said. The bridge wouldn't generate income. It would be there. Some things should just be there, Hannah said. Bridges included. He looked at her. You're not going to argue about the budget. Not tonight, she said. Ask me again when I've done the fall accounts. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile that had been getting incrementally closer to an actual smile across the course of the past week, with each iteration arriving a little more completely than the last. The night's sounds settled around them. The creek, the horses, the mountain going quiet in the way it did after midnight, when everything that moved by heat had stopped moving, and everything that moved by dark hadn't started yet. Hannah set down her tea. She reached into her dress pocket and produced something that caught the starlight, a ring roughly made clearly hand-forged iron rather than silver, with a texture that spoke of hammerwork rather than casting. Caleb went still. I found it this morning, she said. On the windowsill, next to where the horse had been. He'd put it there. He hadn't made a plan about it. He'd finished it the night before while Hannah was asleep and put it on the windowsill, because he hadn't known what else to do with it and hadn't been ready to say what it was for. And then they'd had the courthouse and the families and the telegram, and the day had moved too fast for him to find the moment. The iron is from the bridge support, he said. The burned section. I pulled a piece of it out of the gorge when we were there. He looked at the ring in her hand. I didn't know what to do with it at first. It seemed wrong to throw it away. It seemed wrong to keep it as what it was. "So you made it into something else," Hannah said. "Yes. Something strong," she said. "Something that holds its shape." "That was the intent," he said. "Iron does that if you work it right. If you let it be what it wants to be instead of forcing it into what you expected." Hannah looked at the ring for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Judge Cole married us under a legal provision," she said. "And it served its purpose, and I would do it again without hesitation. But that isn't the marriage I want to keep." She turned the ring in her fingers. "I want to keep the one that starts here, tonight. With no rope, no crowd, no sheriff who owes someone money. Just," she gestured at the porch, "the stars, the mountain, all of it. This." Caleb took the ring from her hand. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, heavier than it looked, which was the nature of iron, which was also the nature of some other things. "I can't promise," he said, "that the past won't follow me. Some of those families need more time. Some of those people in town will always remember the old story better than the new one." "I know that," Hannah said, "and I'm—" He paused, finding the honest word not easy. "I go quiet when I should speak, and I work when I should rest. And I still check the trail every morning before dawn, like someone's coming, even when there's no one coming." "I know that too," she said. "I set 2 places at every meal and reorganize completed paperwork and write letters I don't always send." She looked at him steadily. "We are both people with habits that came from hard years. That doesn't disqualify us." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He reached for her hand. He put the ring on her finger, not with a speech, not with ceremony. With the same care and attention he brought to work, that mattered, the particular focus of a man who understands that how you do something is as important as what you do and who wanted this done right. Hannah looked at her hand. "It fits," she said. "I measured by—" He stopped. "By what?" she said. "By your teacup," he said. "You hold it with both hands when you're cold, and your fingers wrap around a particular diameter." He said it in the direct way he said factual things. It seemed like the right measurement. Hannah looked at him. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was exactly what it should have been. Unhurried, certain, built on the foundation of a week of work and honesty and difficulty and quiet. And 2 people who had each learned through different roads that real things don't happen fast. They accumulate. They earn themselves. They become true, not in a single moment, but across a series of ordinary moments that add up to something neither person could have predicted at the start. When she pulled back, she was close enough that he could see the lamplight from inside reflected in her eyes. "Stay," she said. Same word as before. Same plain statement. "I already told you yes," he said. "Tell me again," she said. "I want to hear it twice." "Yes," he said. "I'm staying." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against his side, and they sat on the porch step in the mountain dark, and neither of them felt any need to say anything else for a while. 3 weeks later, Clara Mercer arrived with Thomas and 2 girls who had their father's eyes. Caleb heard the wagon on the lower trail while he was resetting the last of the bridge survey markers on the north slope. He came down at a pace that was faster than necessary and stopped at the gate before going through it because he needed one moment to be sure he had himself together before Thomas saw him. He didn't entirely have himself together. He went through the gate anyway. Thomas was 7 years old and small for his age, and had Daniel's jaw and Daniel's way of standing with his chin up, even when he was uncertain, which was a posture Caleb recognized so precisely that it hit him somewhere below coherent thought. The boy looked at Caleb with the direct, assessing gaze of a child who has been told important things about someone and is now seeing whether the actual person matches the account. Caleb crouched down so they were at the same height. He held out the wooden horse. Thomas looked at it. He looked at Caleb. He reached out and took it with both hands and turned it and examined it with the seriousness that children bring to objects they understand matter. "My papa had one of these," Thomas said. "I made it," Caleb said. "For him. A long time ago." "Did he like it?" "He kept it on the windowsill," Caleb said. "He said it helped him remember what things were supposed to look like when you built them right." Thomas held the horse against his chest. Clara stood a few feet back with her older girls, and she looked at Caleb with an expression that had a long history in it. Grief and anger, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has carried a narrative that turned out to be wrong for 3 years and is only now releasing the weight of it. She said, "You look like someone who hasn't slept properly in 3 years." "That's accurate," Caleb said. "You look like Daniel said you looked," she said. "He always said you were the kind of man who looked dangerous until you looked closer." She paused. "I should have looked closer 3 years ago." "Clara," he said. "Don't tell me it's all right," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said. "I was going to say, I'm glad you came." She nodded. Her jaw held firm. Hannah appeared at the porch and came down to meet them, and there was a moment of the particular kind of social navigation that women do instinctively and men mostly observe. And within 10 minutes, Clara and the girls were inside, and Hannah had somehow communicated both welcome and practical information about the sleeping arrangements, while also getting the older girl to carry something which immediately gave the girl a role, and therefore a way to be present without the full weight of the occasion bearing down. Thomas stayed outside with Caleb. They stood in the yard together, the man and the 7-year-old, and Thomas looked at the horses in the corral and then at the mountains. "Did you build the bridge?" Thomas said. "Not yet. I'm building a new one, a better one." "Can I help?" Caleb looked at the boy. "Yes," he said. "When you're ready." Thomas considered this. "I might be ready tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow it is," Caleb said. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder lightly, the way you put a hand on something you want to be careful with, and they stood together, looking at the mountains in the late summer afternoon. Weeks after that, on the last hot evening of August, the kind of evening where the heat finally broke at sunset and the air coming off the mountains smelled like pine and distance, Caleb and Hannah stood beside the spring. The channel ran clear and steady through the stone they'd reseeded together on the second morning. The ranch behind them was a different thing from what it had been when Hannah arrived. Not transformed, not made new, but repaired and expanded and occupied in the full sense of the word, occupied by people who intended to remain. Owen was in the upper pasture with the horses. Clara and the girls were inside with Ruth, who had come for dinner and stayed for 3 days and shown no signs of leaving, which Ruth described as helping, and which was also simply Ruth Bell, finding the thing she'd been missing since her son died, a table where people needed her. Thomas was asleep in the back room with the wooden horse on the blanket beside him. Hannah leaned against Caleb's arm and looked at the water. "My uncle used to write that this spring was the heart of the property," she said. "He said everything else could be rebuilt, but if you lost the water, you lost the reason for the rest of it." "He was right," Caleb said. "He was right about a lot of things," she said. "He just ran out of time to see which ones." Caleb looked at the spring for a moment. "He saw enough," he said. "He kept the evidence long enough for it to matter. He left the land to someone who would come for it. He understood what he was doing. He didn't know it would turn out this way." "No," Caleb said. "But he made the decisions that gave it a chance to. That's all any of us can do." Hannah turned her face up to look at him. He looked back at her. Around them, the mountains settled into the particular silence of a late summer evening, and the water moved through the stone channel with the unhurried certainty of something that has found its course and intends to keep it. And the light that remained was the kind that made everything it touched look like something worth keeping. Red Hollow had looked at a wounded man and built a monster out of him because it was easier than sitting with the complicated truth that powerful men sometimes do terrible things, and ordinary people sometimes let them. It had taken a woman with a land deed and a freight-stained dress and a memory for shipping marks to stand under a hanging tree and say no. Not today. Not this man. Not without evidence. It had taken a man who was strong enough to pull his enemy back from the edge of a gorge, because he understood that becoming the monster they'd named him would be the final and worst thing Silas Vane ever did to him. It had taken a boy who was tired of carrying a secret, a widow who had kept her faith in a man everyone else condemned, a sheriff who found his courage one day too late and spent it anyway, and a woman named Elias's niece, who came west in dirty boots and married a man under a rope and meant every single word she said. The deed was confirmed. The spring was running. The bridge was going up. And in the last light of that August evening, a mountain cowboy who had spent 3 years being defined by what a powerful man needed him to be, stood beside the woman he had chosen, and the water moved past them, and the mountains held still above them, and for the first time in a very long time, the future looked like something he was willing to walk toward. Not because it was certain, not because the hard things were finished, but because he was no longer walking alone, and because the person walking beside him had looked at everything. He was. The scars, the silence, the grief, the stubbornness, the years of fighting without winning, and had said, "Stay." And he had. And that was enough. And it was more than enough. And it was the truest thing that had happened in Red Hollow in a very long time.